Welcome to Crypto Clarified, Investing in the Truth, a podcast series where we come together to discuss the most captivating headlines and trends in the crypto space. My name is Benjamin Dean. I'm director at WisdomTree's digital assets team, and I'm joined today by the one and only Jason Guthrie, head of digital asset product. Jason, it's 2023. Off to a good start this year?
It's my second day back from holidays, so yeah, I guess.
All right, well, hopefully it's not going to be a baptism by fire for you for 2023. But hey, look, for listeners, you can find Jason at GuthrieFi on Twitter. You can find me at Benjamin Dean. And for those of you in the US, WisdomTreePrime.com. Join the wait list. You won't be disappointed. It's a new year, 2023. Today, it's just a bite-sized episode. We're going to talk all about crypto lending today, what it is and isn't. Before we kick off the episode, though, I've got to give my usual shout out to James and Sam in compliance. I need to state the following to clarify: the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of WisdomTree and are subject to change. Anything we present in this podcast is not intended to be relied upon as a forecast, research, nor as investment or tax advice. The information and opinions expressed in this podcast, not a recommendation, offer, or solicitation to buy or sell any securities, and reliance upon them is at the sole discretion of listener. Please remember, past performance is no indication of future results. Now on to the fun stuff. Jason, in December, I was walking through an airport and I came across a headline, which is in The Economist. For those of you in podcast land, you won't be able to see this, but I am holding up right now in front of the camera the headline from The Economist in December: crypto's downfall with meteorites falling to the ground. This is a typical bottom signal. It reminds me exactly of December of 2018, the last crypto winter. And when I see something like that, I ask myself, why? Why is this happening? Why are these people saying these things? And I mean, we've talked about this kind of in certain terms in the last year. Why are people thinking that crypto's dead, Bitcoin's dead? What has happened? Now, we know prices are down. That's fine. Prices are down across a lot of asset classes. But the idea that, crypto's downfall, when I look at that and I think about the events we've seen in the last 6 months, I think, why are they saying that? Well, it comes down a lot to something called crypto lending. And this is a relatively new thing. I mean, I'm now starting to be an old school Bitcoiner because I store my Bitcoin on a node that runs in my living room, and I self-custody my own digital assets. This didn't used to exist, this idea of crypto lending, and it's certainly been something in the last year that's dominated the headlines, and I think people are conflating the two a little bit. Jason, you've been following this space as closely as I have. Let's start a little bit for the listeners, like building up from the ground. Crypto lending, what is it? And I guess implicitly, you'll also probably talk about like who was doing it.
Yeah, it's a story that's sort of been dragging on for a while now, right? Like we've talked about this a couple of times at the tail end of last year, and it's obviously been a big story in the media, and there's been a lot of high profile kind of companies go bust as a result of kind of the activities they've got. But like fundamentally, I guess your question is like, what is it? And really, it's one of the financialization activities that has grown up around cryptocurrency as kind of an industry. And it's not necessarily fundamental to the technology or the use case that you see from, cryptocurrencies themselves like Bitcoin. But as I say, it is one of the use cases that grew up around it. So this is people lending of cryptocurrencies as an extension, using cryptocurrencies as collateral in kind of what has turned out to be somewhat of a circular reference, where the industry that was interested in borrowing primarily for like leverage trading or taking collateral as part of these kind of trading activities have really sort of been talking to themselves, and this has kind of come undone very, very quickly and taken a lot of kind of companies down with it. The lending activity, I mentioned there was a lot of stuff around leverage trading, but there's also a lot of lending inside the crypto industry that was driving what was kind of being presented as yields or rewards for a lot of companies as well. And, this has come undone as we've seen some of those borrowers going bankrupt. So a lot of very high profile guys have had a lot of trouble. Celsius, Voyager, most recently kind of Gemini has even got caught up in this as part of the arrangements with DCG. And so, this has been a story that's been unfolding seemingly very quickly, but over what is now a relatively long period of time. But it is sort of a discrete subsector, I would kind of call it, within crypto or within the financialized industry that's growing up around the technology.
Yeah, the financialization of it is a great way to put it, actually. It is taking technology that now evidently works and then doing things with it that maybe it wasn't intended to be built for. But a lot of these folks, like, let's go a bit deeper there on like leverage trading and
Mm.
who was. So you've got two parties, right, with lending. You've got the lender and the borrower. Who are these folks who were borrowing cryptocurrencies and tokens, and what were they doing with it?
So I think, as it kind of turned out, the people borrowing inside that space, it was quite a narrow pool, right? People looking to leverage trade, right? And a big part of this was hedge funds, the most prominent of which was Three Arrows Capital, which has subsequently been a catalyst for a lot of the bankruptcies. Um, and I think it's a very interesting kind of area if you start to unpack it as to why were they borrowing in this space versus, say, the other financial avenues that exist for kind of borrowing. Why were the yields that they were willing to pay, or basically the interest rates that they were willing to pay for that borrowing, why were they so high? And as this is kind of unwound and as it's kind of played out, I think what we're seeing is that these were firms that were taking on quite a lot of risk, right? Essentially, an amount of risk that means that they couldn't borrow from the traditional channels, which is why you pay more interest, and it's why you borrowed from sort of like a fledgling industry. And as a result of kind of that risk, I think we're starting to see it come unwound.
Sometimes when we do this podcast, we talk a bit about like best practices from traditional finance. And it seems like here it's a pretty basic example of where if you're going to go and do lending activities, you go and check out your counterparties, use some due diligence, and then you work out kind of if the risk that you're taking on is commensurate with the interest rate or yield that you're being paid.
Mhm.
It seems like a lot of these folks just weren't following what is a very extensive playbook of best practices, really, from finance.
Yeah, that's something we've sort of said for a while, and something that kind of I've been saying. I mean, the other way to look at it is there's no free lunch, right? If something pays a better interest rate, then has a better rate of return, then there's some risk in there. And presenting it as, equivalent to something in another part of finance, a risk-free rate, or, regular lending, but it's paying 10%, there's something not right there. There's something not congruent. Like, there's never a dollar left on the sidewalk that someone's not picking up. So that is going to be costing something. And people were seemingly willing to kind of look past that a little bit, to think that these returns were going to be, sustainable. And it's evidently not. And in hindsight, that seems somewhat obvious, right? But I do think that it's important to kind of separate out the technology, the asset class itself, from these sort of less than well managed risk taking operations that have grown up on the edges of that kind of technology. People, like you started by bringing up the Economist article, right? The downfall of crypto. Well, it's sort of been the downfall of this somewhat cottage industry that was this lending activity, that was this high yield generation elements on the side. Now, you can kind of understand like where this came from. It's an industry that had seen huge growth in assets. It therefore, if people believe that that's sustainable, they're building business models around like trying to pull more users in, and that's always been the growth of kind of technology companies. But we're just seeing that this path, that this particular outlier use case is not sustainable, but it is very distinct from the technology around which they were trying to build it. And I think that that kind of distinction is super important.
Absolutely. Separating out the technology is one piece. I guess also putting it in context, it's been kind of negative interest rates for a better part of a decade. So why are
Right.
people going out there and trying to find yields like that? It's because they can't get it from their bank account,
100%.
right?
Um, yeah, like I say, people, if you're building a technology company and you want to get large number of users in, you try to attract those users. They were getting very strong VC funding, and the price of their assets was only going up through the tail end of like 2020, right? In that kind of context, what they're trying to do is offer out good returns and structure a business model that sucks people in. And as you say, the thing that was lacking from a lot of people's financial lives was the ability to get yield. So there was a demand there that they were trying to fill, but again, there's no free lunch. So people finding a way to offer these rates in some circumstances, the second the market circumstances change, i.e., the prices start coming down and the VC funding starts drying up, now we've got a big problem. And that's what we've seen unfold here.
There's another interesting element to it as well, and you mentioned it before. It's this idea that it kind of grew up outside of the traditional financial system. And it's interesting to say, like, well, why did that happen? What is it that meant that like the two didn't mesh sooner or more clearly? It's almost kind of like a gap there, which I think is being filled bit by bit now. The idea that these folks they weren't channeling these loans into kind of like small businesses, let's say, into companies that generate something that's meant to be a value add societally, we could say. It was channeled into hedge funds that were taking leveraged long positions on a highly volatile asset class. It's kind of just unusual to see that occur. But if you put it in context, it starts to make a little bit more sense, right?
Yeah, I mean it does, and I think it's been one of my criticisms of the crypto space for a little while is that we talk about this financialization, right? We got somewhat ahead of I think the industry got ahead of itself in seeing this as a financial asset and then just trying to build out the infrastructure use cases patterns that exist in the financial system today around that asset class or around this new way of storing and moving value. Hey, we need lending. Hey, we need prime brokerage. Hey, we need more sophisticated trading, XYZ. I think like the base, what that misses, right, is the basics of what a value store is kind of there to do. It's to facilitate economic activity in its most basic form, allow people to purchase things. But there are more complicated forms, maturity transfers, i.e., like lending, people being able to buy a house, to finance a car, trade financing, small business loans. This is the economic activity that is enabled by a well-functioning financial services system. And then the financialization around that does things to improve liquidity, price transparency, price formation, and investment opportunities. That's great, but it is built on top of some of these more real-world, economically productive use cases. And we are starting to see those come out, but we definitely had the financialization of the space race ahead of those. You know, how do we make things more efficient and more productive? And I think that there's some catch up that needs to happen there for sure.
Yeah. I guess if there's any skiers who are listening, it's a little bit like getting in front of your skis. And you know how that pans out. Now, I said this is just a bite-sized episode, so we've got to cut things relatively soon. But I imagine a lot of listeners are thinking like they've read in the paper about FTX and Sam
Yeah.
Bankman-Fried, and it's all a bit murky. And does this relate to what's happened with FTX? And if so, how?
It does to a degree, right? There's the crypto lending businesses that had big yields and lent to less than creditworthy borrowers, and we've had a problem there. The FTX one is a little bit different, but related in that we've seen loans from kind of one of their corporate entities to another, right? From FTX to Amidala Research, which is essentially their hedge fund that was investing in crypto products and tokens all over the place. And one of the big kind of, well, there were two issues. One, it seems as if they were lending kind of client funds from the exchange to the hedge fund, which was undisclosed and uncollateralized, which was just bad practice. Also, that a lot of the loans underpinning them were done in tokens that FTX themselves issued, which inherently, don't look, in worst case, didn't really have any value. In best case, their value was intrinsically linked to the success of FTX. So as one starts to fall, so does the other. So this idea that there is this somewhat, circular reference occurring in a relatively small, relatively highly financialized and focused space, that leads to points of vulnerability is very similar across the same things. It is different in that, as I say, the client assets being lent without being disclosed, without being risk managed, is a big problem. But there are definitely similarities, and it is related for sure.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. We love clarifying crypto here. That's why it's called Crypto Clarified. And that was an excellent clarification. To kind of summarize what's been a relatively short but informative discussion, what I find fascinating here is that, people used to say to me, the technology doesn't work. Bitcoin's too slow, it's too expensive, no one will use it. And then, of course, Ethereum comes along and it's got tons of different use cases, some of which we're seeing play out here. What's fascinating to me is that this kind of, as you say, cottage industry sprung up very quickly. They didn't use the playbook that you get from traditional finance around running a loan book. That would have seemed pretty evident to me, but hey, that's just me. The technology works. These folks have been able to go out there and build businesses that were not sustainable because they cut corners in places where they're relatively easy not to cut. So if we were to think about how we use this technological infrastructure going forward to actually deliver useful things to folks, where do you think the opportunities lie?
It's a really good question. I think I'll answer this generally as opposed to giving sort of specific things, but we can talk about that as well. We really need to focus on where the core value is added, and the elements of the technology of the ecosystem that offer a markedly better user experience, consumer experience, client experience than what they get today. Right? It's not about a big vision of a disintermediated world or a world without banks, which is a lot of what the loud people on the fringe kind of want to shout about. I don't believe that's what it's really about. But this technology is a fundamentally more efficient way of representing value, of moving value around. It does cut out the need for a lot of reconciliation and intermediation. It's also, an internet native infrastructure that people can build and iterate on top of. And that's really, really powerful. And so what I think people need to start finding is the use cases where, the fundamental characteristics of this technology can be put to work. And for me, those are sort of instant settlement, natively 24/7 uptime, native peer-to-peer transferability, increased transparency, increased control, increased ownership. Find use cases within, it can be within finance with others. I think finance is by far the lowest hanging fruit, but we find use cases, focused ones within that, in which we can build a better user experience around and grow from there. And there are a lot of examples where we can find this. It doesn't need to be everything all at once. You don't need to build, thinking, hey, we've got this big grand vision of the way the world will be, and we're not going to compromise on anything. No, find a narrow use case and deliver genuine value to real people, not just talking to yourself. And I think when we do that, we're going to be able to move out of this, mode of talking a lot about the technology or the asset class or crypto generally, and start talking about how, XYZ experience in financial services is just better now than it was 12 months ago. And that will be powered by a blockchain enabled technology, by smart contracts, by, cryptocurrency underlying it. But people won't necessarily need to know that. You'll just talk about the experience, the function, the use case that got better as a result of using it. And I think people need to get really laser focused on doing that.
Yeah. I know we don't have enough time. Maybe it's something for a future episode, but the kind of tip of the iceberg I see is what people call stable coins, which for the most part right now are US dollar peg tokens. It doesn't take much imagination to see I should back up a little bit. In the last year, while everyone's kept their eyes on the prices of Bitcoin, Ether, and everything else, could fall maybe 50% or more, depending on what you're talking about. The volumes of transactions in US dollar pegged tokens has remained stable. It's actually increased in some cases. And so if you start to use your imagination a little bit, you can see how this technology facilitates US dollar denominated, or it could be any asset really.
Yep.
Exchanges, it could be lending in the future in a way. It just runs on different rails.
No,
And
I think
that's,
safe haven assets. Yeah.
yeah, especially right now. I mean, yeah, US treasuries are actually paying
Yep.
something these days, which they weren't in the past. And again, if we go back to this idea of context, it's important. Context is changing. It's always changing, right? But it's totally different now to what it was 18 months ago. And it's likely
Mm-hmm.
to be different in 18 months from now. So anyway, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. But hey, that's the end of the episode. It's just a bite-sized one. Sorry, folks. But come back soon. We'll join you with some guests, and we will have a much more in-depth discussion about future topics, some of which might include tokenization. I hope everyone's found podcast today useful and informative. Wisdom Tree Prime, for those of you in the US, join the waitlist, wisdomtreeprime.com. You can find Jason at GuthrieFi on Twitter. And you can also find me at Benjamin Dean on the Bird app. If you'd like us to cover any specific topics in future episodes, or just for more information, you can email cryptoclarified at wisdomtree.com. Thank you very much for listening, and have an excellent day.